Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Scotsway podcast. And today I'm joined by the director of the Scottish Gallery, Guy Peploe. Hello, Guy.
Hello.
And Guy's here to talk about the Joan Eardley Centenary exhibition, which is going to be on at the gallery. And I guess the first thing is, why did you want to put on this exhibition?
Well, Joan Eardley would have been 100 years old. Unfortunately, she died at such an early age 42. But clearly it was something that we wanted to commemorate because she was so important to us as a gallery in her lifetime and since. But also in the wider context, it was important that, that there was a dedicated exhibition in the year of her centenary to, in a sense, record what a significant artist she was for the nation.
So maybe you can explain why she was so important to the Scottish Gallery before we go on to look at her life more widely.
Well, I mean, she was born in 1921, obviously, and came to Scotland as a student at the beginning of the war from the south. And she attended the Glasgow School of Art, where she was a sort of star student, really. She had her post-diploma years working abroad and back in Glasgow, and she came to the attention of a lot of people in the Scottish art world quite early on in her life, including Bill Macaulay, who was the senior partner at the Scottish Gallery. So she started exhibiting in the early 1950s, and this was perhaps her most important commercial relationship, but also a nurturing relationship that obviously gave her some stability and some commercial success, not unimportant. She was never driven by commercial considerations, but the success she enjoyed was partly due to the strong relationship she had with the gallery. So right up until she had her first major festival exhibition in 1959, and then obviously she died so sadly in August 1963. And you can ask the question, what might have happened if she carried on? And certainly from a commercial point of view, I think her career, if you can use that expression, would have taken wings. She'd already had quite a lot of success, but it was heading in an extraordinary direction. So that relationship between the gallery in her lifetime, particularly with the senior partner Bill Macaulay, whose children she painted her only commissioned portrait. After she died, the gallery continued to work with her sister. And subsequently her niece, to continue to work on her relationship post-mortem and make sure that her star stayed in the ascendant.
So this is probably quite a big question, but what do you think makes Joan Eardley's work so special?
It is a difficult question and an easy one, because all you have to do is stand in front of one of her major paintings and they're utterly arresting. Whether it's Catterline, which is her second great subject, she had her cottage from the mid-50s right up until she died, or Glasgow, where she kept her studio in Townhead. These paintings are made with great energy and conviction and honesty that communicates itself, I think, very directly. So people, I think, have a personal relationship with Eardley. It's a kind of one-on-one. You're not just tapping into something. It's something that you feel, I think, really in the pit of your stomach. These are, I think, great paintings, beautifully made, as I say, made with a kind of truth and honesty, which it's hard to find anywhere else in Scottish painting.
And you know, you mentioned her career was broken up into, particularly, to simplify it, her time in Townhead and then her time in Catterline. So what are they, because they're quite different in terms of, one is very much urban, kind of often looking at childhood, and then, you know, later it's landscape. It's interesting that it's the same painter doing these things, because they do seem like two very distinctive periods.
Yes, I think that's a very good observation. But it's worth, in a sense, considering the chronology of all this, because she was doing the two at the same time. She traveled backwards and forwards. It wasn't as if one came to an end and then a new subject began for her. And if you enter a room, as people will be able to in August when they visit our exhibition, full of her paintings, in a sense, some of the continuities, some of the kind of the things that make the pictures speak to each other come forward as much as the differences. But you're right, these are two very different subjects, apparently. But she treated them both with the same passion, and there's a kind of dignity about both subjects in her hands, which I think brings them together. But certainly Glasgow is her subject. When she had her studio, she did some early work in Clydebank, and then when she moved and had her 2 studios in Townhead, obviously before it was all demolished, the kind of street, the kind of Glasgow and its children became a wonderful subject for her. And they actually, the kids inhabited the studios. They would come in and be bribed with a bag of sweets to sit there for 10 minutes before there'll be noise in the street, they'd all disappear back out again. And you can see some of those wonderful photographs taken by Oscar Marzaroli and Joan herself and Audrey Walker of the kind of studio interior and the kids outside. And they're compelling as a piece of social history. And the social history in the paintings also. Perhaps in the earlier Glasgow paintings, there's that observation, and partly it is the dereliction that you see, but it's also the life in the streets and in the kids that it gives it kind of that vitality. The community is still there. And later on, the subject became more abstract. She often had a background of a wall that had been graffitied, chalked on, and maybe one child in the foreground and the child almost merging into the background. This became sort of a summation, I think, of her feelings about that subject. And in Catterline, yes, she went there first recuperating from mumps. She'd had an exhibition at the Gaumont Cinema in Aberdeen in 1953, something like that, and then came to a friend said, come down and stay in Catterline, and she obviously loved the place, and she very quickly she got a studio and came to work there, and by the end of her life, it really was her home. But there also, there's a variety of subjects, right down at sea level, the drying salmon nets, the rows of cottages, the fields behind the cliff tops in the summer with all the flowers growing, where she'd press seed heads into the impasto of her oil paintings, making drawing after drawing after 1,000, about 1,500 drawings made, all directly. This will to work was there in an extraordinary way. And then obviously the kind of the storminess of the place. I mean, if anyone's been to Catterline, it's a tight, kind of iron-bound little place with a little harbour and the pier, and the view out over the kind of bleak sea of the North Sea. Imagine a little herring fleet coming in there. So some of these storms coming in, and she's literally with her canvas or a big board lashed to an easel down at the sea with the kind of spray going over her head. You feel the kind of physicality of these works. And you'd love to have been there with her, having that experience. But that experience is there in the work, in the consideration of the work. They're so, including the kind of splashes of probably spume and foam and water coming onto the canvases. And sometimes she'd borrow a bit of blue from the boat builder to get a particular colour that she wanted, and so on. She was again, as she was in Glasgow, she was totally engaged in the community, as well as passionate about the place.
Because I think in both, you get the feeling that she's not observing, but that she's part of it, that she's involved in it, she's right at the centre of it, if you like. Yes,
I mean, there's a word from academia for anthropologists called participant observation, but that's much too dry a term to describe how Eardley was with her subject. She was part of it. Absolutely, she was part of it. And those Sampson kids, was it 10 or 11 kids from one family that she knew well, a lot of whom posed for her, and some of those famous paintings are of Anne Sampson and Andrew and so on. They loved her, those kids. You do get the funny stories about that I'm giving them drawings and then these later being used as a spill to get the stove lit, that evening, it's going to break your heart in a way. But it was, she took whatever she needed as a painter, but through that process, there was a sort of little love involved. I think you could sort of say that about the kids in the place, and that's how she spoke about it too.
A friend of mine was making a short Radio 4 documentary on a guy who owns a chip shop in Glasgow who's also an opera singer. But the guy who was working behind there, I think maybe because we were recording for the radio, said, "Oh, do you know Joan Eardley?" I mean, yes, we do. He says, "I'm one of the kids." Now,
Fantastic.
one of the red-haired kids, and his face just lit up, remembering those times in childhood. It was something. It was unexpected, but it was incredible.
Yes. Well, they're a numerous family, and I think there's some in Australia, and one or two have come back when there've been major exhibitions in the past 20 years and given interviews and so on, which is wonderful that they do feel that connection. It wasn't as if they all ended up getting becoming heroin addicts and going to Berlin. They didn't. They were a kind of a family that obviously were reasonably well looked after, and a lot of them made their way in life, which is great.
You mentioned that she went up and found a studio in Catterline, and I know Catterline is still an artist's, a place that artists are in residence. Did she begin that? Was she the first person to go up and do that?
Yes.
Wow.
I think you can say that Catterline owes its sort of the community of artists that go there to Eardley's memory and presence. And the studio called the Watchy, I think, is now, you can take that and it's sort of available for residences. And lots of people effectively go on pilgrimage and then find subjects themselves.
Yeah.
I think you can also say, I suppose, that that some artists will be in the thrall of Joan Eardley. And when she was alive, people gravitated to her personally and stayed there and worked with her, and latterly obviously looked after her when she became ill. But then there's an artist, another very important artist for us, James Morrison, who died last year. One of Scotland's greatest landscape painters. He was in Catterline from about 1959, and his kids were born there, and they obviously knew Joan very well. And he talks about the community there and her presence. She put a shilling in the pram of John Morrison, who's now a professor of art history, and he was a baby, being Dorothy wheeling him up and down the row in Catterline. And people like Angus Neal, who was a great friend of Joan's from art school, was a troubled man, but she kind of looked after him and he looked after her to some extent. He was there, and some of the younger painters, Annette Stephen and Lil Nelson, who again were great friends and supporters of Joan's, they kind of made Catterline what it was then. Yeah.
And it seems to me that she was well known and well respected in the art world, but over the recent years, I would say, maybe decades, she's come to be one of those Scottish painters that people who maybe don't spend a lot of their time invested in the art world, but know and love. One of those painters, I think, that her reputation has grown over the years. Is that something you would agree with?
It is entirely, yes. Sorry, my son's just come in to collect his maths notes. These things happen on Zoom, don't they?
We can edit that. That's all right.
If you like. No, I think you can say that she was surprisingly, perhaps not surprised, that's not the right word, but she was successful in her lifetime, partly to do with her relationship with the Scottish Gallery, and then a London dealer called Roland Browson Del Banco picked her up, and she had shows there. They were apparently going to take her next exhibition to New York. She was a member of the Royal Scottish Academy, I think, an associate member by the time she died. And she kind of survived the rough and tumble and criticism that she maybe would have had in Glasgow, in the Arts Club and the School of Art. She kind of moved through all that, I think, graciously, because of her kind of dedication to her craft and her extraordinary ability. After she died, you'd have to say there was perhaps a dip, and for maybe a couple of decades, she was kind of a well-kept secret in Scotland. I think that kind of bound her to the Scots at the same time, that we've got Joan Eardley, and you don't know about her, well, you should, sort of.
Yeah. And
then over the last perhaps 20 years or so, with there's a lot of her work in public collections. You can see it on the kind of your paintings website. And the National Galleries of Scotland, they have had a tremendous relationship with great supporters of Eardley over the last 20 years with exhibitions. In 2007, senior curator Patrick Elliott has written a book about her and Catterline, which I think is coming out this summer. There'll be a little display at the Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art. So all these things have come together. There's work in the Tate Gallery. All these things have come together and begun to cement, consolidate, and broaden her kind of wider reputation. So you can say that she is a figure of European significance now. I think you can say that, and back it up.
And would you consider her, sorry, I was going to say, would you consider her a groundbreaker in terms of women in Scottish art as well? Because I guess most of her contemporaries would have been male.
Yes, you can say that. I think Scotland has been well served by women artists. There are some wonderful women painters, but perhaps for a long time that was despite the kind of Scottish art establishment and the kind of wider cultural background, rather than because of any particular support. So they became sort of survivors, and figures like Anne Redpath, obviously Joan Eardley, and many examples more recently. But they were sort of those two artists were the sort of pioneers, if you like, within the academies, within the wider Scottish art world, and they made it easier. They blazed a trail for the kind of generations of wonderful women artists who have come since then.
And in the exhibition itself, you're showing a selection of right across the board her work across her life, yes?
We are. I mean, it is clearly retrospective in nature. She had a short life. She died age 42. So it's all in a sense concentrated into a kind of 20-year period. But it's an exhibition for sale. We've restricted it really to work that we have for sale. And we're fortunate because we had such a long and successful commercial relationship with Joan. So many of the pictures that we've sold, they sometimes come back. We've maybe had a picture 3 or 4 times. There were 3 or 4 different back labels on it coming back with us. So, but we're extremely pleased with what we gathered together. There's no apology for what we're showing in August. We've got some extremely important pictures and lots of wonderful examples right across her subject area. Studies in Europe, the early Glasgow, the late Glasgow, and obviously the Catterline in particular.
I was thinking about this before we spoke, and last year was Edwin Morgan's centenary as well. And I was thinking that, if you want a kind of picture of Glasgow in particular in the kind of mid to late, mid 20th century, then, there are certain artists, you mentioned Oscar Mazzaroli as well, who really do capture it. And I think Joan Eardley has become one of those, if she wasn't already.
Yes. I think that's absolutely right. There's an interesting kind of melding between the individual and the broader culture. So you can't now separate them. I think when people think of Glasgow in the kind of 50s and 60s, yes, you think of some of Morgan's poetry, and of course he wrote a poem for her, and some of the writing, as well. Maybe a little bit later, James Kelman and so on. But Eardley's imagery is so almost central to that, and some people have said, well, it's sentimental, and there's a sentimental aspect to it, but it's never maudlin, and it's heartfelt. And as I said at the beginning of the interview, there's that truth to it, I think, that speaks down the ages, and yes, it's now been absolutely absorbed as part of our cultural identity, and you can certainly say that.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think, if we're talking about Joan Eardley's legacy in terms of Scottish painting, I guess that would be part of it, but what would you expand on in terms of how we view her now?
Well, I think Scottish art in the kind of modern era, the last 120 years or so, it's got some schools, it's got some aspects where you can say there's a kind of continuity, sense aspects of painting, what the French call belle peinture, and so on, is represented by the Scottish colourists and picked up by generations of artists since then. But it also contains a number of individual painters who don't fit in a box, who aren't easy to categorise. And Joan Eardley is certainly one of those, and perhaps she's the most significant. You think of other people like James Curry, John Byrne. You can't say these guys are part of a school. They're not. And Joan Eardley is not part of a school. She is an extraordinary individual artist with that element of genius and that way that she had and has still through her work of speaking directly to the individual, which I think is incredibly important, and we can be extremely proud.
I wonder if that's why she has become so popular, is that if you see a Joan Eardley, you kind of know it's a Joan Eardley if you've seen her work before immediately. It's absolutely her work, and I don't think, yeah, I know it's not part of a school in the say that the Glasgow boys, either early or later Glasgow boys were.
Yeah, I think that's right, and it is going back to that, the sheer presence of the individual work of art. And if you walk into a space where there's an Eardley and you don't know it, you will be drawn to it, and if you do know it, you will have that wonderful wave of familiarity and warmth that you get from sort of a close consideration of these extraordinary works of art.
And when she was up in Catterline and, as you say, became ill, she continued to paint, didn't she? I mean, she was painting right up to the end.
Yes, I mean, she spent the last couple of weeks of her life in a hospice, but before that, her friends were looking after her, and for example, bringing just bunches of field flowers to her cottage, so they would be, put in a vase, and she would paint almost from her side. She was able to work right up until the very end, and those have now become extremely poignant images, of course. But they're not memento mori. They're still heartfelt, optimistic paintings. There's no sense of a kind of physical decline in her work, right up, as I say, until these last things she did in the summer of 1963.
I suppose before we finish, we should get details of the exhibition. It's at the Scottish Gallery from 30th of July to the 28th of August. I think that's
right. I mean, quite what sort of a festival we're going to have this year, no one's clear. Lots will be going on, and of course the visual arts are able to continue. They've never been really a central part of the Edinburgh International Festival in any case. So there'll be wonderful visual arts presentations. So we think of it very much as our festival exhibition this year, and we hope we'll get terrific crowds, and it'll be a kind of a symbol of optimism and regeneration, after these difficult couple of years that everybody's had, and hopefully the experience of coming and seeing Joan Eardley in August in Edinburgh will be part of that new sense of optimism.
And it will be the case that people can just come along and pop in. There's no, booking of.
Absolutely not. Yeah. The only thing we can't do these days is have a private view.
Yeah.
You can't just invite an indeterminate number of people to come and drink wine. So that's gone. But no, we're open. You can walk up, and as long as we're not staggered out, people can come in and see the exhibitions as they would wish.
And there are some events on as well, is that right, to kind of go alongside?
Yes. I mean, that's something that we've adopted in over the last couple of years, is having talks and tours, and we'll do plenty of that in the month of August. And there'll be a demand, and a continuing demand for that kind of digital presentation to carry on, and we'll certainly be doing plenty of that. And there's some people like Patrick Elliott at the Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art and others who have a lot of original things to say about Joan, and new research has been done, and we'll hope to have these voices available during the month of August.
I think it's such a great thing to do, because I think in the past you may have gone to an exhibition and you walk around and you want to know more. You think, well, my knowledge of this person is only slight, if anything at all, and I really want to know more, and that's what you seem to be offering, an insight.
Well, I think yes, the most important that we can do is hang wonderful, thought-provoking, original works of art well lit on a wall, and so people could stand in front of them. But providing that context and in a sense telling the story, that's the modern cliche, isn't it? But it's true. I think the more you know about something, the more you will get out of it. And her story is a tremendous one, which I think a lot of people will know, and if people don't, they'll hear it.
Excellent. Well, Guy, thank you so much for taking time to have a chat with me today. I really appreciate it.
Not at all. Great pleasure for me too. Thanks, Alistair.
No problem. And we'll be back soon with someone completely different. Cheers.